Thank you so much. This is my first time in front of such a large audience and my first time traveling more than 2 time zones, so I'm really excited to be here. So thanks for that introduction. So I'm a self-taught second career developer who has managed to try on a lot of different hats. Today I'm going to talk about a problem I encountered as I started to shift from scripting to front-end roles, how I developed a solution for this problem, and what can be learned about communication and allowing ourselves to build the tools we wish we had. So this talk is a little bit about tooling and a lot about opening yourself up to making the software you need to make your Git flow workflow work for you. So not everyone uses Git in the same way. So before I talk about my Git venture, the Git adventure we're about to embark on together, we should take a moment to review what my ideal workflow at the time I started working on this project was, and where I was as a Git user when I got started. So I got used to Git the way a lot of people do. A loving and very patient friend sat me down and explained those 5 commands I would really need to know. That's add, commit, push, clone status. And after 54 or so requests over Messenger to, can you just tell me one more time? My friend reasonably decided it was time to give me a cheat sheet and kind of cut the cord a little bit. So I've added to this cheat sheet piece by piece, but I've never done a Git intensive. So as you might guess, I had at the time a little bit of discomfort with the time travel aspects of Git. My strategy was to keep things linear, or at least moving in the same direction. At the time, I could push, pull, and check out, but anything fancier felt out of the question. I've included what my typical Git workflow was at the time and listed some steps that someone who is more comfortable with Git and more used to software engineering might have in theirs to kind of give you an idea of what some of those differences were. So for example, you see that I was trying to move through the use of Git in one single push, I would say. So I committed something, I patted myself on the back for it by pushing it immediately and viewing it on the UI online and feeling amazing, and then going back to my coding. And my work up until that time had mostly been scripting. But as I started to do more front-end work, so more visual work, I struggled with the design aspects. And as many of you know, often a client will have a much, much stronger idea of what they don't want than what they do want. So I had to force myself to revert to previous versions. After many of these loops, making changes, making mistakes, having to go back, I began to wonder what I could do to make this back and forth easier. I relied on my commit messages to guide my time travel and researched how to make the strongest the commit messages I could. But because I was making such small changes and experimenting, I found myself struggling to find the right commit to check out. And I started wondering if there was a better way. So, a little bit about me. Before I was a developer, I was a lab geologist whose work relied heavily on photo documentation of rock orientations. And before that, I was building maps for the Mars Curiosity rover. So even more visual. As was mentioned in my introduction, I'm a strong visual learner, and for me, taking in information visually is much easier than any other format. So when I was thinking about this time travel problem I was having, I contributed to an outreachy project, creating a dashboard in a language that was new to me, and realized that when I was learning anything else new, and is there ever a day when we're not having to learn something new, I really had difficulty both imagining the changes described in a ticket and learning a new language. So I started to wish that I could So the cognitive load of having to imagine and learn was really weighing on me. So for me and others that would have been aided by these visual cues, there was a real hole in the documentation. And reaching out to devs on my project, I learned that it was really unusual in the industry to keep screenshots. So there was a whole industry that didn't think like me at all. So I could have felt really bad about this and taken a step back, but I had already become a fan of, letting your users' needs, letting your needs dictate how you use documentation, what you do with your software. And I'd internalized just enough of that hacker ethos that we all aspire to, that I felt I should be pushing forward and, making something to solve the problem. So I started thinking about what might have helped me and all of the Veronica similar folks that would come along. My next project is where I started to take action. Although I was hired as a web developer, many of my tasks relied on design skills I didn't have. While I Googled and imagined icons and layouts and tried to grasp what would make a website useful, appealing, and intuitive to users, I made many, many mistakes. Often, I would go to bed certain that I was on the right path and wake up only to find that my layout felt like the web equivalent of pairing polka dots and plaid. And neither me nor my client were ready to make that bold of a choice. Or sometimes I'd move forward for a week or more, only to find that my client, on seeing exactly what they had asked for, wanted to go in a different direction. So who's had that moment? Anybody else doing client work in this room? I see a couple of hands like that. We have all been there. So above, you'll see variations of a logo I made for one client. At the time I made these, I didn't know the research that design entails. So after an initial conversation, I was turning out variations and believed that I was practicing design. Has anyone ever built something without considering all the parts of the project that they didn't know how to build individually? Anyone? So many folks, not just me. Having a reach passion project is a great motivator, but having to go back to tutorial level foundational projects as you start each component makes the process of learning and finally building long and slow. This was the position I was in as I tried to learn design principles on the fly. So, on the right, I made a, thankfully, non-exhaustive list of methods that designers use to research and determine the choice of action that would address their clients' concerns as effectively as possible. It's probably good for all of us, all of the devs in the room, if we haven't considered how critical and, frankly, academic the work of designers do is, to just take a moment and look at how exhausting this non-exhaustive list is. You'll notice that the steps that I was doing are all the way down the list. I had skipped all the deep information finding and gone straight to, let's build stuff. Honestly, I had internalized some toxic ideas like, ideas are cheap, make it or it didn't happen. And those ideas undersell the importance of foundational investigative work that helps us ask, what should we be building? And because I wasn't taking those steps, I was making many, many changes and reverting many, many times. All of this iteration and redesign after feedback put me in a special kind of version control hell. It was extremely hard to track these changes with commit messages, and especially with my memory. Having to throw myself into design, face first, the hard way, I wouldn't recommend it, opened me up to new ideas about how to use Git. So this back and forth meant I had to do a lot of Git time travel, and I was again relying on my commit messages. 2 problems with this. 1, we all know what happens to commit messages when we've been working too long. Yes, I had some trash commit messages to decipher. As much as I researched how to make the most helpful Git messages, and there are some guidelines up there, I still fell into that dark place that this comment references. So what commits should I be making? Looking here, we have 2 changes that are being made to our nav bar. We have a font color change and an underline used to indicate which page we are on. But what could you say in your commit message to give yourself a mental picture of the images? So I started out by saying, remove the lighter green font and add underline to navbar. But there are 5 different greens on my website. So I started to think that maybe I should be more descriptive and say, remove lighter, brighter font, but these commits got longer and longer, and I thought I was doing a good job, but when I needed to actually view my changes, I had all these long descriptions that had me wondering if it was the lighter green, or the lighter green, or the really light green, or maybe the light neon green. It was a mess. That was a mess, and also my Git history was messy and hard to navigate. I had to manually roll back to several points just to find the version that I needed if I had made a mistake. So where could I go from here? What cues could I give myself? There were a few things that I could try. I could use the tools that I had better, such as trying to write better commit messages. I could find tools that give my brain the visual cues I needed, or I brainstormed about this for some time. To address the problem, our design friends might tell us, we need to define the problem. The difficulty was that I didn't know how far back I would be going, and I hated the process of doing it. Look at all those steps. Understand that as a visual person, and others experimenting with any back and forth visual work may have the same experience. And as a relatively new developer, I was mentally recreating an image in my brain from these commit messages. The loop of going back and forth and maybe going to the wrong place was frustrating for me and took me outside of my productive flow, which as a relatively new programmer is a scary place to be. If you have something that's working well, you want to continue. So I set out to smooth out this part of my workflow. So without a framework, I put on my problem-solving engineer hat and looked for ways to make it easier to preview without rolling back, and I came up with a few solutions. I was already keeping screenshots to show clients, so it seemed natural to keep my own personal folder of screenshots. Sometimes I would flip through these like a flip book to look for trends that might inform me of where I should go next. But when I had to look for a specific image, like I need that 4-link navbar without underlines, I still struggled looking through timestamps or tiny icons. I realized that I need those images to be connected to my version control to do me any good. Meanwhile, I had learned about in-editor hex color previews, which are amazing and everyone should try. Some even let you add different colors from a UI so you can experiment even faster. These helped me when I was coding, but to open rolled back code in my editor, I would have already needed to do that git checkout dance, which messed up my flow and I didn't like. So I started thinking about a more programmatic solution. My next step was to save a screenshot in Git, linked to a commit message so you could click and see what the page had looked like at the time of that commit. So what pain points remained for me? I had the time spent taking the screenshot by hand At the time, I was still, Shift 4, bloop. I might forget to add a screenshot or add the wrong one, and suddenly I was back at that giant folder that I described earlier. I had the time spent renaming and linking my screenshots, and the time I spent wondering how often to take screenshots in the first place. It was a pain, it was slowing me down, and this was all made worse by the fact that I had started to worry about this wasted time. I didn't know how to address this. I had used the tools that I knew of. Like an engineer, I had put them together to solve a problem in a creative way, but I had made new problems too. And I was starting to think I didn't know what problem to solve. I started talking to other developers about my idea, and people disagreed a lot. Such strong reactions told me that I should look into this more. Interestingly, usually those working with agencies said, but we don't have time for that kind of documentation. Individual contractors, that's me, were excited because they would have an additional form of documentation for themselves. And folks in large companies, surprisingly, to me at least, said, oh, we have that. I had to talk to these folks more. So the developers in these companies really had something to say. And we talked about screenshot diffing, which is used by, honestly, I think every large company that I've spoken to. eBay and Google are a few. And they use comparing screenshots as part of their testing process. So screenshot diffing, who uses screenshot diffing in their work and life, regression testing? I see a bunch of hands, and that's super. And you can take a little nap during the slide if you want, or correct me if I'm wrong. So in one example, I used a nice picture up here to keep things simple. But if we have these two images, to our naked eye, they look the same. But if we are to compare them with a computer, we can see that there's areas that are different. Perhaps there's a filter. And so what happens with screenshot diffing is we have our golden right up there in the top corner, and we compare these two images, and if they are a certain percent different, it's brought down to a human, and our poor human has to look and decide either this is the correct image, I'm manually making this the new golden, our new image, or they say, oh, this is wrong. They change whatever they believe needs to be changed and send it right back up through the process. So, interestingly, I wouldn't have known about this at all. I had never used or heard of this before, and I would have never known if I hadn't gone through the process of talking to a whole bunch of developers, about 50% of which told me my idea was the stupidest thing they'd ever heard of, and they didn't need it. But I talked to that other 50%, and they really had something to say. So there's a lot to be gained from talking to folks who work with different tools and different settings, etc. So as I thought about the visual aspects of my problem more, and my decision, of course, was reinforced by the success of talking to more folks within my industry, I realized, just like a number of devs, that there was a group I wasn't talking to, designers. So the thing that surprised me most about discussing this idea with design folks is how quick they were to point me to tools that they had used and how much curiosity they had about Git and other tools used by developers. We heard early in a previous talk how powerful it can be for a design person to use developer tools and to share that experience. We're working so closely, sometimes just desks away from our designer mates, but we often don't understand what they're doing, how they're doing it, or what we could learn from each other. So in all cases, my designer chats were extremely eye-opening. If you haven't already, I'd definitely encourage you to talk shop with some folks who work on a different aspect of your project. You might be surprised what you learn. In conclusion, don't be this cat. He's not having any fun, and he's not learning anything new. In my case, I learned that designers had already solved my problem. So Sketch's pages, which you see on the right, is similar to the idea that I had with a folder that you flip through. And that is how, and so it was a very visual, you say like, here's what we had at point A, here's what we had at point B. And a lot of folks would use it as a flip book. For me, this was super validating. Abstract compare mode is actually a Git for Sketch or prototyping files, right down to the commands and visualization. I was shocked. Designers had been wanting a Git for their visual work the same way I wanted visuals to support my code-based work. Designers have a Git. So I set out, of course, to find out if I could get some visuals more smoothly into my workflow. So far, I had taken some steps. I had made, like, we might call it an early prototype. I had seen some problems. I had confirmed that other people had these problems. They were common. And I had researched how other folks had solved related problems and kind of gotten the lay of the land. So what are our pain points? We have still the time to take the screenshots. We had to remember to take these screenshots. And we had to find a way to add an image link to our commit messages. And I did a lot of research and talked to a lot of different folks, and I learned that because of screenshot diffing and its popularity, there's a lot of tools that are not that anyone can use for small projects. They aren't all proprietary, and two of those are Puppeteer, if you are into Python, one of my favorite languages, or Puppeteer. And so those are often connected to screenshot diffing and will allow you to create those images. So as far as remembering to take the screenshots, we learned a little earlier about Git hooks, and which, if you weren't in those discussions, it's basically a script that allows other things to happen when you take an action within Git. So in this case, when we do a commit within Git, Git will turn and kind of tap Puppeteer and let them know that it's time to take a screenshot. I'm still working on this third step, and if anyone has ideas, I'm happy to hear them. But my idea right now is to have a terminal prompt. I enjoy using the terminal to encourage you to save by hand, like, hey, have you done this? But if other folks have other ideas, I will be around after the talk, and I would love to chat. So we can think of each of these kind of like a wrapper of this that calls other steps. So one part of this exploration for me has been realizing the value of my experience, both as a geologist in my past life and as a visual learner in my always life, and what those can bring to my work. It's a hard realization to come to because as I started to transition careers, many folks couldn't hide their shock. They said, a geologist? Well, that's a shift. Similarly, when I started to explore screenshots and Git, I heard some very strong, we don't do that. This is rough stuff for people to hear, and I felt as if, as I was working towards my first job, that I would need to put my past life behind me so I could be successful in this one. The shame of that is that I now realize that I was most able to contribute when I realized the value of my past. So this affects a lot of people. As I was writing this talk, I got a Twitter message out of the blue from a career-shifting academic that thanked me just for talking openly about my academic research, the research I had done. And he went on to, and I was really surprised by this because who isn't able to talk about, their research that they've done in the past? But it really can matter a lot to folks and also allows you to do your best work. So at whatever point you can bring your whole self to work, I encourage you to do that. So being able to use our past and our skills is powerful and is going to make us better programmers and, frankly, better people too. So should you be using screenshots in your version control? I don't have an answer for you. The nearly 50-50 love-hate split that I found as I was talking to developers definitely indicates that's an idea worth chewing on. And I can't help but notice that since there's roughly 65% of humans that are visual learners, and about 50-50 people who strongly loved or hated this idea, there might be a whole lot of overlap there. We could get into a whole correlation causation discussion at some other time, and I don't have the data for that, but this is a thing that might be happening. So if you're looking for new ways to support a more diverse group of contributors or teammates, I would strongly encourage you to consider pushing back a little on "we don't do that" and explore some new options. So here are some tools that I used as I was in my exploration that you might find helpful. There's no time for questions today, but I really hope there's a conversation that grows around this, and I strongly encourage you to tweet or find me at the break. And I want to thank you all for being such a great audience. I've never spoken to more than 20 people before, so it was really nice to have a supportive crew. There are a lot of you. So I'll also be speaking twice more this month on this topic, so if you want to do the Twitter thing, you'll get to hear more about my Git venture. And I just wanted to thank you and say, have a wonderful day.